I glanced nervously at my reflection in the glass doors of the supercenter. It was my first day on the job, and the store, the largest in this small, isolated town, loomed like a monolith in the dim evening light. The parking lot was eerily empty, save for a few scattered cars. The faint buzz of the flickering neon sign above the entrance sent shivers down my spine. Inside, the store felt even larger, its endless aisles stretching out under harsh fluorescent lighting. The air was stale and faintly metallic, a smell that seemed to cling to my clothes. I was greeted by Mr. Grayson, the manager, a wiry man with thinning hair and a strained smile. He exuded a nervous energy, his eyes darting toward the corners of the store as if he expected something to jump out. "Welcome, Alex," Mr. Grayson said, handing me a crisp blue vest. "Let's get you started with orientation." The process was straightforward: safety protocols, customer service tips, and where to find the time clock. But as the session wrapped up, Mr. Grayson's demeanor shifted. He hesitated, then pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. His hand trembled slightly as he held it out to me. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice low. "This is a list of rules specific to this store. Follow them exactly, and you'll be fine." I took the paper, frowning. "Rules? Like what?" "Just read them," Mr. Grayson said, avoiding eye contact. "And whatever you do, don't ignore them." The other employees, who had been milling about the lounge, suddenly fell silent. Their uneasy glances only added to my growing discomfort. One of them, a young man about my age, opened his mouth as if to say something, but a sharp look from Mr. Grayson silenced him. Sitting alone at a break room table, I unfolded the paper. The list was handwritten in neat, deliberate strokes. It read, "Rule 1, do not answer customer complaints between 2:03 and 2:13 a.m. Rule 2, if an item falls off the shelf without reason, put it back immediately and do not turn around. Rule 3, never enter aisle 13 after 3:12 a.m. no matter what you hear. Rule 4, if a man with a green jacket asks for assistance, lead him to the frozen foods aisle and leave immediately. Rule 5, if you hear your name whispered over the intercom, clock out and leave the store." I laughed nervously, but the sound felt hollow in the empty room. It had to be a prank. Yet, when I looked up, the expressions of my coworkers said otherwise. One employee, an older woman named Carla, caught my eye and shook her head slowly. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a tight line. "You'll see," she murmured. Her voice carried a weight that made my chest tighten. The first few hours of my shift were uneventful. I stocked shelves, greeted customers, and learned the layout of the store. But as the clock approached midnight, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavier, and a faint hum seemed to emanate from the walls. The store felt wrong. The aisles were too quiet, the lights too bright yet oddly dim at the edges of my vision. Even the customers, sparse as they were, moved silently and avoided meeting my gaze. At around 1:45 a.m., the store emptied out completely. I hadn't noticed the last customer leaving, but suddenly I was alone in the massive space. The silence was so profound it felt suffocating. I could hear every creak of the shelves, every flicker of the fluorescent lights. I tried to focus on my tasks, but the hum seemed to grow louder, a vibration that crawled under my skin. At 2:10 a.m., a loud crash echoed through aisle 9. Startled, I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was sharp, metallic, and too deliberate to be random. It didn't feel like an accident. After a moment of hesitation, I forced myself to walk toward the sound. My footsteps seemed deafening against the tile floor. When I arrived, I found a can of soup rolling lazily across the floor. There was no one else around. The aisle was perfectly still, except for that single can. My pulse quickened as the rule flashed in my mind. If an item falls off the shelf without reason, put it back immediately, and do not turn around. I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder. The aisle behind me was empty. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum that seemed to grow louder. Swallowing hard, I bent down, picked up the can, and replaced it on the shelf. The moment my hand left the can, a faint, raspy breathing sounded behind me. My entire body tensed, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, but I didn't. My legs felt like lead as I walked, then jogged back to the front of the store. The breathing followed me, growing louder with each step. It was wet and labored, like someone struggling to suck air through waterlogged lungs. The sound filled my ears, drowning out the hum, until I crossed the threshold into the main aisle. Then suddenly it stopped. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The silence returned, heavier than before. I forced myself to look back at aisle 9. It was empty. The can I had replaced sat exactly where I had left it. But something felt wrong. The air around the aisle shimmered faintly, as if it were bending the light. I didn't wait to find out more. For the rest of the night, I stuck to the front of the store, finding tasks that kept me as far from the aisles as possible. The breathing didn't return, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, just out of sight. I counted the minutes until my shift ended, and when it finally did, I bolted for the parking lot without even saying goodbye to the other employees. By the end of the week, I had started to settle into the routine, though the rules lingered in the back of my mind. I hadn't told anyone about the breathing, but the memory haunted me. On Friday night, I was restocking the cereal aisle when I heard it. A soft, pitiful crying coming from aisle 13. I froze. The sound was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more desperate. It sounded like a child. Never enter aisle 13 after 3:12 a.m. no matter what you hear. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the boxes in front of me, but the crying continued. My chest tightened. It was so real, so heartbreaking. I couldn't just leave it alone. Against my better judgment, I edged closer to the aisle. The fluorescent lights above flickered more erratically the closer I got. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath forming in front of me, swirling in faint, ghostly patterns. Peering around the corner, I saw nothing unusual, just rows of canned goods and cleaning supplies. But something felt different. The aisle seemed longer than before, stretching into a dim haze that shouldn't have been there. The crying grew louder, now echoing as though it came from a vast, empty cavern. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling and cracking with fear. The sound echoed back to me, distorted and wrong, as though someone else were mimicking my words. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. My breathing felt too loud, each inhale and exhale grating against my ears. I stepped forward cautiously, my hands shaking. As I reached the midpoint of the aisle, I saw something move in the haze ahead. At the far end of the aisle, a pale, gaunt figure stepped into view. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin, bending at unnatural angles as it moved. Its head hung at an odd angle, and its jerky, twitching movements made my stomach churn. It didn't walk so much as glide, its feet barely touching the floor. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure's head snapped upward, and though its face was obscured by the haze, I could feel its gaze locking onto me. My chest tightened, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. The figure began to move toward me, its limbs cracking and twisting as it advanced. A low, guttural sound, a mixture of a growl and a moan, emanated from its form. The lights above buzzed violently, some shattering in bursts of sparks that rained down like fireflies. Finally, my instincts kicked in. I turned and sprinted back down the aisle, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The figure's uneven footsteps echoed behind me, growing faster and louder with each passing second. I didn't dare look back. As I reached the end of the aisle, I felt a sharp, icy wind rush past me, as though something had swiped at my back. I stumbled into the main aisle, nearly crashing into a shelf, and spun around. The figure was gone. The haze had dissipated, leaving the aisle empty and silent. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, gasping for air before finally retreating to the front of the store. My hands shook so violently I could barely hold onto my scanner. For the rest of my shift, I avoided aisle 13, staying as close to the exit as possible. But even as I clocked out and left the store, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something had followed me. By my third week, I had grown accustomed to the strange rules. I followed them diligently, even as my curiosity burned. But one night, while stocking shelves near the electronics section, I heard my name whispered over the intercom. "Alex!" My blood ran cold. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It repeated, drawing out the syllables. Al-X. I dropped the box I was holding and froze, my heart racing as I stared up at the intercom speaker. The store was completely silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I waited, hoping I had imagined it, but the voice came again, louder this time. "Alex, come here!" Every muscle in my body screamed at me to leave, but I felt rooted to the spot. The voice was almost hypnotic, drawing me in with an eerie familiarity. It sounded like my own voice, distorted and hollow, echoing in ways that defied the small space of the store. I grabbed my scanner and walked quickly toward the break room, desperate to clock out. The voice followed me through the speakers, growing more insistent. "Alex, don't leave! Stay!" As I reached the time clock, the lights flickered violently, plunging the store into near darkness. My trembling fingers fumbled with the keypad, and I swiped my card just as the voice roared, "Don't go!" The sound was deafening, reverberating through the store like a thunderclap. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me as I stumbled out of the break room and toward the exit. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, flickering like static on an old TV. As I burst through the front doors, the oppressive weight lifted, replaced by the cool night air. I turned to look back, and my heart nearly stopped. Standing in the dimly lit entrance was a figure in a green jacket. It didn't move. It just stared at me, its face obscured by shadow. I jumped into my car and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. The figure remained motionless as I started the engine and sped out of the parking lot. My rearview mirror was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I barely slept. The voice haunted my dreams, whispering my name over and over. When I woke, my throat was raw as if I had been screaming. I decided then and there that I couldn't keep working at the store. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Determined to uncover the truth, I confronted Mr. Grayson the next day. "What is going on in this store?" I demanded. Mr. Grayson sighed heavily, rubbing the bridge of his nose. His usual nervous demeanor seemed heavier, weighed down by exhaustion. "This place, it's not like other stores," he said finally. "It was built on land that attracts things, unnatural things. The rules are there to keep us safe, to keep it contained." "What do you mean by it?" I pressed, my voice rising. "What's in this store?" "You don't want to know," he replied. His eyes flicked toward the break room door. "Breaking the rules invites it. You've already drawn too much attention." But I wasn't satisfied. That night, I stayed late, determined to find answers. The store was empty when I stepped back inside. The atmosphere was stifling, the air thick and charged like the moments before a thunderstorm. Every step echoed through the vast, silent space. I broke every rule deliberately. I ignored falling items, letting cans roll and clatter across the floor. At 2:07 a.m., I answered a fake customer complaint, the words catching in my throat as I imagined something unseen listening. The response was immediate. The hum that had always lingered grew into a deafening roar, vibrating the very walls of the store. Lights exploded overhead, showering me in sparks. Shadows stretched and twisted, bleeding out from the aisles as if alive. And then they came. Dark, shapeless entities emerged from the shadows, their forms flickering and glitching like broken television screens. They moved unnaturally, jerking and shifting as if skipping frames of reality. Their whispers filled the air, overlapping and intertwining. My name, spoken in countless voices, some familiar, others alien. I ran, my heart pounding as the entities pursued me. Their forms stretched impossibly long, their flickering appendages reaching for me. Shelves toppled in their wake, the sound of crashing metal and breaking glass ringing in my ears. No matter how fast I ran, they seemed to close the distance effortlessly, their whispers digging into my mind like claws. I stumbled into the frozen food section, the cold air hitting me like a slap. One of the entities was right behind me, its static-laden form towering over me. Its featureless head tilted, as if studying me, before it reached out with a shifting, amorphous limb. Desperation took over. I grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and swung it with all my strength. The extinguisher passed through the entity harmlessly, but the force of my swing sent me sprawling backward. The entity paused, as if amused, before it surged toward me. In that moment, a blaring sound filled the store, the emergency alarm. Red lights flashed, casting the entities in harsh, eerie shadows. They recoiled, their forms distorting and flickering more violently. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the exit. The entities didn't follow me outside. The automatic doors slammed shut behind me, and the oppressive weight lifted. I collapsed in the parking lot, gasping for air, my hands trembling uncontrollably. My wrist burned, and when I looked down, a faint, glowing symbol had appeared on my skin. It pulsed faintly as if alive. I quit the job the next day, but the horrors didn't stop. At home, lights flickered. Shadows loomed in corners, and the hum, that dreadful hum, persisted in the background of my thoughts. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the aftermath of a bad experience. But it was relentless. A week after my resignation, I received a package in the mail. My heart sank as I saw the handwriting on the label. The same precise, deliberate strokes that had detailed the rules on my first day. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, identical to the one Mr. Grayson had given me. This time, the rules were for my own house. Rule 1, keep all lights on after 11:30 p.m. Rule 2, do not look out of any windows after midnight. Rule 3, if you hear knocking at the door, do not answer it. I stopped reading and dropped the paper. My breath caught in my throat. This isn't over, I murmured.